Brad, go ahead. Like, start leading us through this. So you found this article, and you started going down the rabbit hole. Like, I'll do that all the time, right? First thing, I'm looking for the circus. Next thing you know, I'm looking at articles about public opinion. Next thing you go down the rabbit hole, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So the if folks have or have maybe have not seen DeGrau, I'll give a real quick synopsis on that. So we heard this, or Eddie already kind of knew this legend organically about this kind of mythical character DeGrau, who came to town, and maybe he had a silver mine, maybe who knows what the story really was. There's 4 or 5 different stories, and he was like I said, a very legendary mythical character. A lot of the characters in all of those stories I could not find on censuses. I could not find them in newspapers other than, the treasure story. So the very first thing I did with this story is Oliver Perry. I looked him up on censuses, in the newspaper, property records, and he's definitely a real dude. He was born in the late 1700s. He died 1820, just like that newspaper article said. And from that point on, I was like, all right, I was excited about DeGrau, but it was very mythical. This one was definitely real. Did he hide the treasure in his grave? That might be a myth part of it, but the guy was real. And all of the other characters that we came across in these newspapers were definitely real. So we thought that this was in the story. I mean, come on. What a
yeah,
story. Like, this has to be the next series, right?
yeah,
And just the craziness with, there was that first article. So for folks who maybe have not seen the first episode of Grave of Gold yet, so we found this first newspaper article, and it was this gentleman basically telling the story of how this guy was up in the mountains. And the newspaper that Eddie and I read in episode 1, we pare it down substantially. It's a very long article talking about this guy and how he had this tavern up in the mountains, and he was, accused of being a killer. But then when he did eventually die, another gentleman purchased the tavern, and the tavern existed until the early 1900s. And this guy who wrote this article was a grandson of the guy who bought the tavern after Perry died. So he has like firsthand knowledge of this. He's been there. The grave, Perry's grave was dug up by somebody, and he must have seen it firsthand to tell this story in the newspaper, right? And then, so as I'm doing more research on this, I discover, like a year later, this guy's cousin, the author of the newspaper's cousin, writes to a different newspaper and is like angry about it. He's like, that's not the story. Perry was a great man. He wouldn't kill anybody. And in fact, that's, disparaging on our grandfather for purchasing the land from a murderer. He wouldn't have done that. And so he tells like a slightly different story about how this hobo was invited onto the land and built a cabin. And he, in fact, hid some money on the property. Still a treasure story. Now we
sure.
have 2 different stories, right? Which one is true? Maybe there's a little bit true from each one, and we thought that this would be a great topic for a next series. But the big problem, 2 big problems. One is that it exists somewhere inside what's called the Bennington Triangle, which maybe Eddie can explain in a bit what the Bennington Triangle is. But problem number 2 was there. The first newspaper said it was in Reedsboro, Vermont.
Mm,
It's not. It's not in Reedsboro, Vermont. Article number 2 said it was somewhere on a turnpike between was like Troy and Brattleboro. I mean, who knows? We didn't know where it was, and there was so much conflicting information in the newspaper articles. We kind of had to. We had a lot of research on our hands, which is a few things we talk about in episode 1, how we narrow down where we're going to search for this. But
mm,
like I said,
mm.
problem number 1 was the Bennington Triangle.